On a chilly January evening in 2019, a young woman named Miriam Vallejo stepped out to walk her dogs, a familiar ritual she'd performed countless times before. A mere 20 minutes later, she was discovered clinging to life on the cold ground, the victim of a brutal attack. The question was, what happened in those 20 minutes? Her death would ignite one of Spain's most perplexing criminal investigations, a case defined by 90 stab wounds, 4 dogs that remained silent, and a prime suspect who was ultimately allowed to walk free. It was a case that was officially closed, only to be mysteriously reopened 6 years later by new evidence that promised to change everything. This is the story of Miriam Vallejo, and it's a search for justice that continues to this day. Miriam Vallejo Pulido was born on August 9, 1993, in Alcalá de Henares, a city in the community of Madrid, Spain. As an only child, she was raised by dedicated, hard-working parents who poured all their love and energy into providing her with the best possible life. From her earliest years, Miriam displayed an extraordinary affection for animals. She was known for rescuing cats, caring for dogs, and surrounding herself with pets of every kind. This wasn't merely a childhood phase. It was a deep-seated passion that would ultimately define her life. Those who knew Miriam consistently described her as empathetic, sweet, thoughtful, and deeply affectionate. She had a unique sensitivity to the world around her, one that made it impossible for her to ignore the suffering of others, whether human or animal. By all accounts, she was the kind of person who simply made the world a brighter place. In her studies, Miriam excelled. She was known as a dedicated and respectful student with a clear aptitude for the sciences. As a young girl, she dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, but life ultimately steered her down a different path. She would graduate as both a nursing assistant and an administrative manager, and in time, she secured a position as a laboratory technician for a pharmaceutical company. There, her colleagues remembered her as a model employee who was completely devoted to her work. Miriam was diligently building a future for herself, working hard and saving money to make her dreams a reality. And one of her biggest dreams was independence. Though she loved living with her parents, like so many young adults, she longed for a place to call her own, not just for herself, but also for her 2 beloved dogs. This led her to approach her friend, Celia. Since Celia also had 2 dogs, Miriam proposed an idea. They could move in together and find a larger space, where all 4 of their pets could live comfortably. By splitting the rent, it would be affordable for both of them. Celia was immediately on board with the plan. Soon after, a 3rd person joined the arrangement, Celia's boyfriend, Sergio Sayas. Sergio and Celia had originally met at a battery recycling company, where he worked as a maintenance technician, and she was employed in the lab. The trio soon moved into a rental home in Villanueva de la Torre, a quiet town made up mostly of housing developments, bordered by vast open fields and rustic country paths. It was a tranquil area with little commotion, a place where neighbors generally kept to themselves. For Miriam, it was perfect. She took full advantage of the natural setting, especially for walking her dogs. Her typical route led her through the sprawling, empty fields near her house, a place where she often enjoyed long walks with her canine companions. And it was here that the stage was set for the events of January 16, 2019, the night that changed everything. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, a young couple walking nearby came across a horrifying sight. On the ground before them was a woman, still alive, but gravely wounded and clearly in agony. One of them frantically dialed emergency services, explaining they had found a woman in terrible condition, lying on the ground in a remote and difficult-to-access area. First responders arrived on the scene as quickly as they could, but it was too late. There was nothing that could be done to save the young woman, as she had already succumbed to her devastating injuries. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The victim was soon identified as Miriam Vallejo. According to neighbors, she had only been living in the area for a few months, and had not yet become a familiar face in the community. The same was said of her 2 housemates. What people did recall, however, was seeing her walking her dogs, always seeming quiet and keeping to herself. The forensic report would later reveal a shocking detail. Miriam had sustained an astonishing number of wounds, all inflicted by some type of bladed weapon. The sheer brutality of the attack was shocking. Investigators immediately started going door to door, asking if anyone had witnessed anything unusual that day. To kick off their investigation, detectives began to reconstruct the final hours of Miriam's life. They discovered she had left her house at approximately 8:30 that evening. She was walking all 4 of the household's dogs. All of them were large breeds. 2 belonged to her, and the other 2 belonged to her friend, Celia. Celia happened to be out of the house at the time. That evening, Miriam was testing out new light-up collars on the dogs, and had initially set off on her walk with a group of neighbors. They were also out walking their own dogs, but only a few minutes later, she separated from the group and turned down a dirt path. This path was a known shortcut from her home to an empty field. Scarcely 20 minutes after leaving the house, her assailant struck. From the very beginning, investigators ruled out a sexual assault. The evidence simply wasn't there. They also quickly dismissed robbery as a possible motive. Miriam's personal belongings, including her cell phone, were all still on her. Furthermore, the attack itself was incredibly targeted and ferocious. This brought investigators to a chilling conclusion. There had to be a personal connection between Miriam and her killer. That suspicion was confirmed when the medical examiner's report was released. Its findings were nothing less than horrifying. Miriam had suffered a total of 90 wounds, which were inflicted by 2 separate blades. The majority of them were classified as superficial. The first strikes landed on her back and abdomen, indicating to authorities that the attack started from behind. 8 of these wounds were clustered around her kidneys, and these were considered potentially fatal blows. But it was one single wound to the chest that ultimately claimed her life. Some cuts had even reached her forehead and the roof of her mouth. Forensic experts estimated the entire ordeal lasted approximately 10 minutes. To put that in perspective, 10 minutes is an eternity to endure such a savage assault. Surely someone must have seen something, heard anything. But in those critical opening hours of the investigation, it appeared that nobody had. What's more, it was obvious Miriam had fought back fiercely. She had 2 broken fingernails, as well as cuts, bruises, and clear evidence she had been dragged. There had been a violent struggle, and she had put up a desperate fight for her life. But investigators believe she never really had a chance to get away. Because the attack came from behind, it caught her completely off guard. Then, another detail captured the investigators' attention. Her dogs had neither reacted nor attempted to protect her. And to be clear, these were large, powerful animals that were extremely attached to Miriam. It stands to reason that if a stranger had attacked her, the animals would have responded at the very minimum, by barking to alert anyone in the area. Yet, the dogs did nothing. They didn't come to her defense. They didn't even make a sound to indicate anything was amiss. This all pointed to one chilling conclusion. Miriam's killer had to be someone the dogs knew, someone they trusted, someone from within her inner circle. As this theory began to solidify, investigators began to scrutinize the people closest to Miriam, and one name quickly jumped to the top of the list: Sergio Sayas, her roommate and Celia's boyfriend. Based on the initial timeline, Sergio was supposed to be at work when the murder occurred. His employer confirmed he had punched out at 8:38 p.m. The problem was that his job was located in Torrejón de Ardoz, roughly 40 kilometers away from Villanueva de la Torre. Police calculated the drive between the 2 locations would take a minimum of 45 minutes, and with the attack occurring around 8:50 p.m., it seemed physically impossible for Sergio to have been at the crime scene. But then, investigators discovered something deeply unsettling. Traffic cameras had recorded Sergio's car near the scene of the crime at 8:48 p.m., just 2 minutes before Miriam was assaulted. This piece of evidence completely destroyed his alibi. There was simply no way he could have made that drive in only 10 minutes unless he was traveling at an unbelievably reckless speed. When presented with this evidence, Sergio's story began to unravel. He finally confessed that he had not driven directly home from work that night. Instead, he offered an alibi. He'd driven to a nearby town to buy hash from a supposed dealer, but investigators weren't buying it. Why drive that far for a simple drug deal? And more telling, he couldn't give them a name or a single detail about this so-called dealer. On May 21, 2019, 4 months after Miriam's murder, police executed a search warrant on Sergio's parents' home. In Alcalá de Henares, the search was meticulous. They were hunting for the murder weapons, any blood-stained clothing, anything that could tie Sergio to the crime. What they uncovered was deeply troubling: a machete stashed in the trunk of his car. Inside the home, they found several knives and other edged weapons. They also seized a trove of clothing that might hold critical forensic evidence. The following day, Sergio was arrested and taken in for questioning. But once there, he invoked his right to remain silent. He wouldn't answer a single question about the night Miriam was killed. Despite his silence, police felt they had enough circumstantial evidence to keep him in custody. On May 23, 2019, A judge ordered Sergio held in pretrial detention without bail, citing clear evidence pointing toward him and deeming him a flight risk. For Miriam's family, it felt like a breakthrough. At last, someone was being held accountable, but their relief was fleeting. As the investigation wore on, cracks began to form in the case against Sergio. First, there was the issue of his physical condition immediately after the crime. According to eyewitnesses, Sergio didn't have a single visible scratch on him. No cuts, no wounds, no injuries whatsoever. This was crucial, because Miriam had fought for her life, breaking her own nails as she struggled violently against her attacker. Forensic analysis revealed skin tissue under her fingernails, clear evidence that she had scratched her assailant. Yet Sergio bore no marks from that kind of fight. Then there was the problem of the forensic evidence, or more precisely, the total absence of it. Even after investigators seized bags of clothing from Sergio's residence, a full forensic workup found not one trace of Miriam's DNA on any of his clothes. No blood, no skin cells, absolutely nothing. For an attack so brutal and drawn out, this seemed impossible. How could someone stab another person 90 times over a 10-minute period, and not leave a single trace of the victim on their clothing? The investigation was about to take another bizarre turn, this time involving Celia, Sergio's girlfriend, and Miriam's own roommate. She began sending strange messages to Sergio's brother, claiming that the clothes Sergio had been wearing on the night of the murder had been burned. She strongly hinted that she had inside information about the case. When detectives brought her in for questioning, Celia gave them a wild story. She claimed her information came from a psychic, who had supposedly revealed the details to her. Investigators, however, found her claims to be completely unsubstantiated, and ultimately, a dead end for the investigation. On September 20th, 2019, the decision to keep Sergio in custody was upheld, with the court affirming there was significant evidence pointing to his guilt. But after 4 months behind bars, everything changed on December 20th, 2019. Sergio was released from jail. The judge explained that prosecutors simply hadn't gathered enough evidence to make the charges stick. The court had just received a report from the Civil Guard's forensics lab, detailing the analysis performed on the clothing, seized from the home of Sergio's parents. Not a single piece of clothing contained a genetic profile matching Miriam's. Sergio was freed without bail, but with conditions. His passport was confiscated, and he was ordered to report to the courthouse weekly. After his release, Sergio told reporters he felt relieved and very satisfied. For Miriam's family, the news was a crushing blow. Then, in December of 2020, the case took a shocking turn. A man named Alberto, who was battling several addictions, checked himself into a rehab center in Madrid. Out of nowhere, he started talking about Miriam's murder, sharing details that immediately got the authorities' attention. Alberto was no stranger to law enforcement. He had a criminal record and had previously served time for assault and for intentionally crashing a car into his own mother's house. He had crossed paths with Sergio during a 10-day stint in rehab, where Alberto admitted to other patients that he was unable to sleep at night. Alberto claimed he had done something so terrible it robbed him of his rest, which naturally prompted investigators to examine his possible connection to the case. Ultimately, they concluded his claims held no real weight and offered no tangible proof, leading them to completely dismiss him as a person of interest. At the same time, Miriam's family was grappling with an overwhelming grief, a sorrow deepened by a desperate search for answers within their own community. Vigils and tributes were held in her honor, and at these gatherings, her loved ones pleaded for justice. Desperate for any explanation of what had happened to her, their frustration and mistrust grew, and they began to openly question the lack of transparency in the investigation and the mixed signals coming from the authorities. There were countless inconsistencies, too many alibis that just didn't hold up, and a mounting suspicion that the family was being deliberately misled. For the family, what made it all the more painful was the memory of Sergio, who had stood by their side through their darkest moments. He had provided them comfort and support as they mourned Miriam. The case went cold until January of 2023, when the presiding judge made the decision to dismiss it. The ruling cited insufficient evidence to pinpoint a responsible party, based on her review of the known facts. There was simply not enough cause to continue the case against Sergio. The prosecutor, however, argued that this reasoning was inadequate. He backed an appeal filed by the family's lawyers, insisting that closing the case required a more thorough explanation. Just as Sergio's defense team made a public statement of their own, they announced plans to sue for damages, claiming the arrest and the ensuing legal battle had destroyed his life and the lives of his family members. A central piece of their argument was that Sergio's father had been fighting cancer, and the immense stress of the case had drastically worsened his health. He died just a few weeks later. They were also demanding the return of Sergio's personal property, which included the machete, his car, and a large quantity of clothing that had been confiscated. His attorney stated their intention to demand compensation from both the government and several media organizations for a sum in excess of 300,000 euros. Miriam's family, meanwhile, never wavered in their public calls for justice. The case was now officially closed. It seemed to be the end of the road. But then, something remarkable happened. In July of 2025, more than 6 years after Miriam was killed, the case was abruptly reopened. The move to reactivate the investigation stemmed from new evidence that, because of legal constraints, has not yet been revealed to the public. Officials confirmed they had new leads and information that gave them grounds to reopen the investigation. All signs indicate that these new leads may be connected to a critical piece of testimony from one of the very first witnesses. One statement, in particular, stood out from an individual who claimed to have heard voices piercing the silence of that night. This witness was believed to have been nearby as the events took place, and although this person saw nothing, they distinctly heard the terrified screams of a young woman pleading, "Let me go and leave me alone." The use of plural phrasing in the victim's cries immediately grabbed the attention of investigators, as it implied more than one attacker was involved. Authorities explained that among all the tips they had received, they now had a solid basis to restart the investigation, and they assured the public that every new line of inquiry would begin from scratch, entirely independent of the previous effort. The first step in this new phase was a full-scale reconstruction of the crime at the very spot where Miriam's body was discovered. An operation involving the homicide division, forensics teams, drones, and even the K9 unit. The reenactment began at the house where Miriam had been living, and traced the path to the location where she was ultimately found. A police officer stood in for Miriam, walking the entire route accompanied by 4 service dogs. Right there at the crime scene, an officer reenacted the exact words a witness reported to the police. The words Miriam supposedly screamed that night were, "Let me go and leave me alone," a critical piece of evidence in this new line of investigation. Because of this, Sergio has been cleared as a suspect, marking a major turning point in the investigation. The judge has also ordered forensic experts to broaden their analysis to see if more than one person was involved, and for Miriam's family, this reopening brings a renewed sense of hope. They admit it's an agonizingly difficult process, but they are holding out hope for a breakthrough, vowing they will never stop fighting until the person, or people, responsible for taking Miriam's life are finally identified and held accountable. These new leads have cracked open a window of hope in a case that had long gone cold, but so many questions still linger. Who killed Miriam Vallejo? Was it one person, or were there multiple attackers? And why didn't the dogs make a sound? What really happened in those 10 minutes? The case is still open, and justice has yet to be served. Miriam was only 25 years old when her life was so brutally ended. She was a young woman with so many dreams, filled with compassion and a profound love for all animals. She deserved to live a long and fulfilling life, surrounded by the animals she loved and the family who treasured her. Her memory must be honored, not just as the victim of an unsolved murder, but as a powerful reminder of why seeking justice is so critical. Every victim deserves answers. Every family deserves peace. And as this investigation pushes forward, the hope remains that the truth will finally be revealed, and that whoever is responsible for this horrific crime will at last be held accountable. This is the story of Miriam Vallejo, a story that is still being written.